Hello, welcome to today's lesson. Today we're going to be talking about experimental studies. We're going to focus on the design of experimental studies. Let's go ahead and start by reading the learning objectives. Remember, the learning objectives are going to be the goal you're trying to accomplish by the end of this lesson. I encourage you to come back to the learning objectives after you're done with the lesson and to ask yourself if you did accomplish the learning objectives. Okay, so let's go ahead and read them. Identify the difference between an observational study and an experimental study. Another goal is to be able to identify the main characteristics of experimental studies. And the last goal is to identify explanatory variables, response variables, and lurking variables. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start by talking about observational studies and experimental studies. We're going to talk about what they are, and then you're going to be given some scenarios and you're going to be asked to determine if you're looking at an observational study or an experimental study. An observational study is when an investigator collects data merely by watching or asking questions without applying or withholding a treatment. Again, without applying or withholding any treatments. Okay. In these studies, nothing is changed or controlled. So in most cases, we see an investigator conducting a survey or an investigator looking at medical records, the data within those records. Okay. Another example could be an investigator looking at teaching methods. And the investigator in this case would mainly be observing how someone is teaching a subject. You're not applying, you're not withholding a treatment, you're not changing or controlling anything. On the other hand, we have experimental studies. And this is when the investigator will be changing a variable or explicitly applying, withholding a treatment to determine its effect. We're going to see a few examples of experimental studies. Again, in these studies, you're going to see that a treatment is being applied or withheld from the participants. For example, if you're testing a new drug, you would have to have the participants take that drug to see the effects of the drug. So again, in this case, we're changing a variable. So now let's go ahead and look at some examples where you're being asked to determine if you're looking at an observational study or an experimental study. We're going to look at the first two examples together, and then I'm going to let you do the last example on your own. Starting with part A. You want to determine what fraction of undergraduate students at a higher institution support a new $25 annual fee to improve the student union. You randomly selected 1,000 students to survey. Notice here, you're going to be conducting a survey with the 1,000 students that were randomly selected. Here, you're not applying a treatment. You're not withholding a treatment. Okay? So, thus, this is an observational study because you are conducting a survey. And again, no treatment is being applied. So now, in part B, it says you want to determine if cinnamon reduces a person's insulin sensitivity. You give patients who are insulin resistant a certain amount of cinnamon and then measure their glucose level. Okay, so here you're giving participants or patients cinnamon. What are you measuring? You're measuring their glucose level. Okay, so notice a experiment is going to be when an investigator changes a variable. Okay, so if you're applying or if you're giving the participants cinnamon, the cinnamon could change the glucose levels. Okay, so you are changing a variable. You are applying a treatment. So this is a experimental study. And let's just go ahead and write cinnamon is the treatment being applied. And let's go ahead and write a variable is being changed. We have an experimental study. Okay, so go ahead and look at C on your own. Determine if the experiment is an observational study or an experimental study. Now, let's talk about when do we use experimental studies versus when do we use observational studies? Okay, so a experimental study is fundamentally important when trying to show a causal relationship between two variables. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the example above. In part B, we're trying to see if the variable amount of cinnamon and the variable glucose levels, we're trying to see if those two variables have a causal relationship. Does one affect the other? Okay. Now, observational studies are generally only sufficient to show association or to form a hypothesis. So this association or hypothesis can later be checked using an experimental study.